Good evening. 55 years ago this weekend, the US Supreme Court finally decided that black and white American citizens could never again be segregated in its schools, colleges or universities. A landmark judgment in the long history of slavery, emancipation and segregation of the black population of the USA. On this evening's programme, we dip into that history as we explore the American Civil Rights Movement and the dark days of slavery that preceded it.
We belong to people. They'd sell us like they sell horses and cows and hogs and all like that. Have an auction bench, and they'd put you up on the bench and bid on you, just same as bidding on cattle, you know. If I had any idea that I'd ever be a slave again, I'd take a gun and just end it all right away. You're not a thing but a dog.
A quote there from a slave in the 1800s. Slavery was part of the US almost from the founding of the nation in 1776. So why and how did it all start? What was the American Civil Rights Movement all about? And did the election of Barack Obama close the historical circle? Margaret E. Ward, financial journalist and New Yorker, joins me this evening. Margaret, you're very, very welcome.
Thank you very much, Myles.
We would not associate New York with slavery, but we'll come to that because it goes back to the 1700s. And how did the slavery business begin?
Well, America was part of a big business syndicate called the Transatlantic Slave Trade, and the business was conducted between Europe and Africa on one side of the Atlantic and the Caribbean and the Americas on the other side. So basically, Europe sent guns and manufactured goods like linen and clothing to Africa. Then in Africa, people who had been captured and sold into slavery, often by neighboring tribes, were sold to the white man and loaded onto boats for...
Good evening. 55 years ago this weekend, the US Supreme Court finally decided that black and white American citizens could never again be segregated in its schools, colleges or universities. A landmark judgment in the long history of slavery, emancipation and segregation of the black population of the USA. On this evening's programme, we dip into that history as we explore the American Civil Rights Movement and the dark days of slavery that preceded it.
We belong to people. They'd sell us like they sell horses and cows and hogs and all like that. Have an auction bench, and they'd put you up on the bench and bid on you, just same as bidding on cattle, you know. If I had any idea that I'd ever be a slave again, I'd take a gun and just end it all right away. You're not a thing but a dog.
A quote there from a slave in the 1800s. Slavery was part of the US almost from the founding of the nation in 1776. So why and how did it all start? What was the American Civil Rights Movement all about? And did the election of Barack Obama close the historical circle? Margaret E. Ward, financial journalist and New Yorker, joins me this evening. Margaret, you're very, very welcome.
Thank you very much, Myles.
We would not associate New York with slavery, but we'll come to that because it goes back to the 1700s. And how did the slavery business begin?
Well, America was part of a big business syndicate called the Transatlantic Slave Trade, and the business was conducted between Europe and Africa on one side of the Atlantic and the Caribbean and the Americas on the other side. So basically, Europe sent guns and manufactured goods like linen and clothing to Africa. Then in Africa, people who had been captured and sold into slavery, often by neighboring tribes, were sold to the white man and loaded onto boats for the Caribbean, South America, or the United States. In the Caribbean, then slaves worked on plantations that made sugar and rum for sale to Europe, and America's slaves produced cotton and tobacco for transport to Europe. So it was all about the money.
And what was the life of a slave like?
Slaves were simply considered a unit of labor. Southern slaves were manual laborers. They picked cotton, tobacco, other crops. They might tend livestock, weave clothing or blankets. Some were trained as blacksmiths, carpenters. And one slave that was interviewed by the government in the 1930s recalled that his mistress did not allow her slaves to be mistreated because she was raising slaves for the market, and she considered it poor business to mistreat them. But then there were the house slaves, and they were the highest in the pecking order, and they often received the best treatment because they were domestic servants who worked in the kitchen or kept an eye on the children. But as you'll hear in a moment, compared to white people, it was hardly a lavish existence.
They give all the niggers fresh meat on Christmas and a plug tobacco all round. The highest cotton picker gets a suit of clothes, and all the women, what had twins that year, gets an outfit of clothes for the twins and a double warm blanket.
Well, as you can hear from that clip read for us there by Hope Brown, kindness is relative.
Well, Myles, some slaves were bred like horses or dogs to supply the ever-growing need for them in the labor-intensive agricultural industry.
Slavery was the worst days was ever seen in the world. They were things past telling, but I got the scars on my old body to show to this day. I seen them put the men and women in the stock with their hands screwed down through holes in the board, and their feet tied together, and their naked behinds to the world. Solomon the overseer beat them with a big whip, and Master looked on. The niggers better not stop in the fields when they hear them yelling. They cut the flesh most to the bones, and when they taken some of them out of the stocks and put them on the beds, they never got up again.
Okay, that's a very, very graphic description of the ill treatment suffered by slaves. And, they were commodities, they could be sold. And, one of the most horrendous things about all of this was the fact that children born into slavery would simply, or could simply, and often were, taken away from their mothers and fathers and sent elsewhere.
Absolutely. And couples were separated as well, husband and wives. If they lived on different plantations, they'd get married, they'd have their wedding night, and that was it. They'd be shipped back to the other plantation, maybe not to see one another.
And of course, female slaves were sexual commodities as well. And some of the best known American politicians, for example,
yes, indeed,
would have had relationships with slave women and would have had children by slave women.
They did. It was quite common for the overseer, for the owner, to take advantage of the young women that were there.
Tell us something about the overseers on these plantations then.
The overseers were the ones who did the actual supervising on the farm. So the master wouldn't generally tend to be the one out in the fields. The overseer was the one who would watch the slaves as they picked the cotton or whatever. And the treatment of the slaves varied hugely depending on the disposition of the master or the overseers, who were sometimes Irish.
I looked down and saw a freckled, ginger-colored Negro, squat and muscular, with thick lips and a sparse reddish head, 35 or perhaps 40. He had the blood in him somewhere of an Irish overseer or the sign of a James River manor or a traveling Pennsylvania tinker. There was a Raymond on every plantation.
Now, slavery, Margaret, was a very lucrative business, but even so, obviously, there were a lot of objectors to slavery. This is going back into the 18th century, long before the Civil War period of the 19th century.
Yes, although it was normal for a lot of people, there were people who said, well, this just isn't right. These are human beings. They're not animals. For example, in 1783, the state of Massachusetts outlawed slavery within its borders. And 25 years later, in 1808, the importation of slaves was banned, but the illegal slave trade continued. And
there was a strong abolitionist movement. Well, that was based on religion and morality, wasn't it?
It was. There was then a split, say, between North and South, remembering that the North was industrial and the South was agricultural. But a lot of the abolitionist movement came from the North. And in 1861, the Confederate States formed. Remember, those are the ones that formed the southern part of the American Civil War, which began in that year. And 2 years into the war, in 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and that freed all slaves in the areas that were still in rebellion. And then 3 years after that, in 1865, the Civil War ended and slavery evaporated away.
But even before the Civil War and even before the Emancipation Declaration, there were slaves who were emancipating themselves. There were a lot of runaway slaves. What was the legal status of the runaway slave in the United States?
Well, they were property. And property ran away, property would be captured. And there was a lucrative group of people who would hunt them down and return them to their masters for a fee. But there was also, you might remember, the Underground Railroad, which went from the south all the way up to the north. And the most famous person who helped with that was a woman called Harriet Tubman. So on one side, you had the abolitionists trying to get slaves out. And on the other, you had people who were trying to capture them for money and bring them back to their masters.
And you had some freed slaves who became very, very famous. People like Frederick Douglass, for example, who actually visited this country and who was friendly with Daniel O'Connell.
Yes, and in fact, one of the most interesting books you could ever read is his diary. The Diary of Frederick Douglass, a small book, but fantastically written, and it really gives you some insight into his life as a slave.
Now, Frederick Douglass was a success story, but there were other stories, there were many, many other stories, where slaves who had freed themselves or who had been freed were essentially almost as badly off as they were in the North as they were in the South.
Yes, I mean, Myles, to a certain extent, they were institutionalized. They had everything looked after, from their food, sometimes their bedding or not their bedding, and then suddenly they were free men, but they didn't know anything about, say, how to go get a job, how to feed themselves, what to do if they needed medical treatment. So it did become an issue for many people.
We was all slave children, and after we found out that we was free, we was bound out to different people, and we would run away and wouldn't stay with them. Why, then we'd just go and stay anywhere we could, lay out at night in underwear. We had no home, We were just turned out like a lot of cattle. You know how they turn cattle out in the pasture? Well, colored people didn't have no beds when they were slaves. We always slept on the floor, pallet here and a pallet there, just like a lot of wild people.
Just to say that these clips are actually from the transcripts of interviews with slaves. They would have been undertaken by the WPA, by the Roosevelt WPA. That was during the Depression era. Now, civil rights. We think of the Civil Rights Acts as the 1960s, but there was a Civil Rights... obviously you talked already about the Emancipation Act, which abolished slavery in 1863. That was Abraham Lincoln. 1875, there was a Civil Rights Act. Tell us what rights that gave to black slaves or to ex-former slaves in those days.
That's right. A lot of people don't realize that, but there was a Civil Rights Act of 1875, and that was introduced by Charles Sumner and Benjamin Butler, and it said it guaranteed that everyone, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, was entitled to the same treatment in public accommodation, such as inns, public transportation, theaters, and other places of recreation. But the act had little impact.
Why did it have little impact?
Probably because there wasn't the will. Also, think about how do you inform slaves that they're free and what their rights are? There were almost 4 million slaves in the United States, and in terms of communicating the message, I'm not so sure that got across.
Okay, so that's 1875. That's 12 years after slaves have been emancipated. There's a Civil Rights Act on the statute books, but it's having essentially no effect. Fast forward almost 100 years to 1955. Not a lot had changed in the intervening period. Slavery was gone, but discrimination was institutionalized. In what ways was it institutionalized?
Well, the South in particular lived by what were called the Jim Crow laws. The Jim Crow laws were state and local laws in the United States that were put in place soon after the end of the Civil War in 1876, and they lasted until 1965. And they mandated racial segregation in all public facilities with a supposedly separate but equal status for black Americans.
So in reality, this led to treatment and to accommodations, if you like, that were usually inferior to those provided for white Americans, which created a number of economic, educational and social disadvantages for black Americans.
Yeah, some examples of the Jim Crow laws were the segregation of public schools, we know that quite famously, public places, public transport, buses, trains, and the segregation of restrooms, restaurants, and drinking fountains. I think we know many images of that, different drinking fountains for both whites and blacks. And unfortunately, even men who fought for their country in the war were treated differently. That's
something we heard about in a recent public interview I did with the Reverend Jesse Jackson. He shared his earliest memories about when his father came back from the war in 1945.
I remember him talking about how black soldiers who would come to Europe to fight had to sit behind Nazi POWs. And on military bases, Nazi POWs had privileges that they didn't have on the base, and how fractured his feelings were about that. And I remember one day, after he was discharged, while cutting grass and raking leaves in the white neighborhood, a man came down the steps, immaculately dressed, and talking funny. He was talking differently than whites tend to talk in the South. I said, "Dad, what is this guy?" And I looked up, and he was crying. It was overwhelming to me to see him. "Why are you crying?" We went to fight those guys to set America free. He can go downtown and work and vote, and I cannot. So I remember his coming home, and I remember just how shattered he was, that Nazi POWs had rights that black soldiers did not have, and yet he was determined to overcome that.
Now, Jesse Jackson grew up in Greenville, South Carolina. This southern state had been a huge beneficiary of the slave trade, and it was still a deeply divided society of haves and have-nots. This is where he describes his early life.
We would go downtown and could not drink water at the fountain, said colored and white. The toilets were colored and white. We could not go to the zoo, only for certain special occasions. There was not one black policeman in town, nor fireman, nor city hall worker. After all, we didn't have the right to vote. And whites could use the skating rink and organized ball and the swimming. So we were locked out of all of those social amenities and learned to live in our own little world, and even limited by those walls, you can dream above walls. You need not be limited. You can be in a hole and dream of being on the mountaintop. You can be in jail and dream of being free. And somewhere along the way, my sense of dreaming and hope was inspired and convinced by my parents that nothing was wrong with me. Something was wrong with the system.
The Reverend Jesse Jackson there talking about his early life in Greenville, South Carolina. Margaret, by the mid-50s, things had started to change. Schools that had been all-white schools or all-black schools were to be no more. And the American Civil Rights Movement, essentially, I suppose it effectively began with a woman called Rosa Parks. Rosa did something very, very simple. She refused to move to the back of the bus. Explain to us, first of all, what she did, and explain why she had to move to the back of the bus.
Well, it's amazing. I was reminded of this recently by my daughter, who's 8 years old, and she's being taught this in her Irish school. And, you know, to just remember the story of 1955, this woman, she was just dog-tired, and she'd been working all day, and she refused to move to the back of the bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, white people sat in the front, and black people sat in the back, and those were the rules. And she absolutely refused to move, and it was required by the law that she should move. But then a boycott followed, and a bus segregation ordinance was declared unconstitutional. So what was happening here is Americans were really starting to deeply question what was going on in society, and the laws were starting to follow. So there was then a ban on segregation in interstate trains and buses, but the South, of course, strongly resisted these moves. And in 1956, a coalition of Southern congressmen came together and they said, no way, and they resisted the Supreme Court desegregation rulings. And in probably one of the most famous images of the civil rights that we all remember is the forced desegregation of a school in the South by the National Guard. Now, that was in 1957, and it was in Arkansas. And they used the National Guard to block 9 black students from attending Little Rock High School. We remember Little Rock, of course, because of Bill Clinton. Following a court order, President Eisenhower sends in federal troops to ensure compliance.
Yeah, it's interesting to remember that because people associate the action taken by American presidents in this kind of a context with people like Kennedy and Johnson, but Eisenhower was actually the first to send in the troops. But there was an increasing awareness, though, of systematic racism. It was happening all over the USA, and I think it's safe to say more and more people were beginning to take action.
They were. I think people who never questioned what they knew as normal were starting to say, maybe there's something wrong with this system. And sit-ins were beginning by black students in restaurants in the South, you know, where they had been segregated before they would actually sit at the counter. Northerners piled into buses to help on the Freedom Ride, Southerners as well. And all the while, federal troops attempted to keep calm and enforce desegregation. And that was around the same time that my Irish mother from Carlow emigrated to the United States as a nurse, and she lived in New York, but she was also keenly aware of what was going on down south.
And tell us something about some of the sit-ins, some of the actions that were taking place. The Freedom Riders, for example. Who were the Freedom Riders? They
came from everywhere, but I think they met in Washington, D.C., and they would get on these buses and go down south to help with the sit-ins, to help with the marches, to help support people down south who were, you know, encountering an awful lot of violence and pressure in their communities.
And this was a very dangerous thing to do. I think
certainly was.
To a certain extent, some of this kind of thing is covered in the movie Mississippi Burning.
That's right.
Now, Jesse Jackson became involved in the early sit-in protests in the southern states in 1960 and met Dr. Martin Luther King soon after that. Their philosophy was one of passive resistance, and many of the protesters ended up in jail.
I left jail where I went to school wearing all of the credentials of having been in the jail. We put honor and dignity in the jail cell. If you didn't go to jail, something was wrong with you. You got your stars from your scars.
Now, the 5 years, Margaret, from 1963 to 1968 are the most dramatic, the most violent, I suppose, and the most significant in the civil rights movement.
I think that this is probably an extraordinary time for any Americans who lived through it. Early during this period, we had civil rights leaders basically being picked off one by one. Medgar Evers and Malcolm X were assassinated. Bobby and John Kennedy, who were well known for their involvement in the movement, were also murdered. There were race riots, bombings, kidnappings, marches all over the South. I mean, you can just imagine what the television and radio news was like every single night. And whether society liked it or not, the change was happening. So in the mid-60s, that marked the first time a black man had been elected to the Senate in decades. The first black Supreme Court justice, and 2 men were also elected as mayors of major U.S. cities. So the change was happening. But as the change was forced through, a more sinister element emerged.
Yeah, and part of the effect of that sinister element was, of course, the assassination of Martin Luther King. That was on the 4th of April, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee. Jesse Jackson, who was with him that day, has this memory of the event.
Dop, dop, and the bullet hit him in the neck. And I heard someone, I think Reverend Bevel, saying, "Get low." Because whoever it was, if they had scattered the gun, all of us, you know. I remember going toward the steps, and he was lying there. I remember Reverend Abernathy coming out saying, "He's my friend, let me get to him. And I got up and walked to the phone and called Mrs. King and said, "I think Dr. King has been shot in the shoulder." I could not really say what I saw. And I think within 5 minutes, the Associated Press had called her and said he had been killed. So that was very traumatic. But what hit my mind was that we could not let one bullet kill a whole movement.
Jesse Jackson talking about the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King. James Earl Ray was convicted and sentenced to 99 years in prison for Martin Luther King's murder. Now, there were riots in the immediate aftermath of that murder, but in the longer term, did it have an impact on the American civil rights movement?
I think it did. I think it gave people this incredible energy to say, hang on a second, this just is not right, and we need to push harder and go faster than we have in the past. And I think that the memory of this amazing man pushed them forward and gave them hope.
Okay, after the break we'll be hearing from Clarence B. Jones, who was Martin Luther King's lawyer and advisor. He was also the man who helped King shape his historic "I Have a Dream" speech.
I have a dream this evening that one day we will recognize the words of Jefferson that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
When those words were spoken on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on the 28th of August 1963 in front of 250,000 people, it marked a turning point in history, not just for America, but for the world. As the crowd stood electrified, Martin Luther King Jr. brought the plight of African Americans to the public consciousness and firmly established himself as one of the greatest orators of all time. The man who helped to shape that speech was Clarence B. Jones, who was an advisor and close friend to Martin Luther King. The behind-the-scenes story of the weeks leading up to the speech has now been told by Clarence B. Jones in his newly published book, Behind the Dream. And Clarence joins me now from the Bay Area in the USA. Clarence, good morning to you.
Good morning. How are you, sir?
I am very well indeed. Can you tell us, how did you personally become involved with Martin Luther King?
Early in 1960, when I was a 29-year-old Korean War veteran, just out of law school, I met Dr. King in connection with, he had been indicted by the state of Alabama for tax evasion and perjury. And his chief defense counsel in this criminal case had asked if I would help and be as a law clerk, as a gopher, in the preparation of the defense of the case, and that's really started our relationship.
And you were involved in his letter from a Birmingham jail, which was a very important document in his career.
That was some 3 years later, when in April of 1963, when he was arrested and in jail along with several other hundreds of demonstrators for protesting the racial segregation in public facilities in Birmingham, Alabama. And since I was his lawyer at that time, and one of the few people who was authorized to go in and meet with him, yes, I went in to see him actually to talk about an urgent problem we had, and that is to provide bail money for the number of young people who were in jail with him. And when I came into his cell and to talk with him about, I wanted to get his advice and suggestions on how we can urgently raise bail money, he virtually dismissed me. Not that we weren't close friends, but he was preoccupied with responding to a full-page ad which had been placed in the Birmingham Herald newspaper, earlier that day or maybe the day before, and the substance of the ad was accusing Dr. King of being an outside agitator, and suggesting that everything in Birmingham would be fine if he would just go away. And it was signed by 8 white clergymen, 8 white ministers, and so he felt that his greater priority was to answer that ad, and he was in the process of writing a response which turned out to be his letter from the Birmingham jail.
Now, the March on Washington, the Great March of 1963, wherever you went, though, around that period of time, before the march, while the march was being organised, you always had a friend by your side, the FBI.
Yes, I did. I say that I can respond to it humorously the way you put it. Just factually, your listeners should know is that from July 13th, 1963, until through 1967, the end of 1967, every telephone conversation that took place between Martin Luther King Jr. and myself from my office, from my home, was wiretapped. And then the conversations were transcribed, written down by the FBI, and we didn't know it at the time. And then additionally, there was a companion photographic surveillance.
And bearing in mind that you were his legal representative for large parts of that period, and therefore any transactions between the two of you were privileged.
That is correct. In fact, under the Freedom of Information Act, when I finally was able to read a copy of the illegally wiretapped phones, that is a transcription of those conversations, there would always be a large legend at the bottom of each page, or on each page, or at the beginning, which indicated in effect that this is top secret or secret, and should this ever be publicly disclosed, would be would be harmful to the best interest of the United States.
And, of course, the FBI famously tried to use or considered using the sexual dalliances of Martin Luther King Jr. to undermine the March on Washington, didn't they? And his movement in general.
That is correct. That is correct.
The march itself, before we actually talk about the march, let's hear another clip from the famous and the fabulous speech of Martin Luther King. Here, he's talking about the obviously all-important issue of segregation.
The Negro is no longer willing to accept racial segregation in any of its dimensions. We have come to see that segregation is not only sociologically untenable, it is not only politically unsound, it is morally wrong and sinful. In a real sense, we are through with segregation now, henceforth, and forevermore.
Now, Clarence, the march was organised by a coalition. Did that lead to disputes and differences?
Well, yes, and any coalition, coalition by definition means that you have various component parts, various organizations, and the chief objective, of course, is for everybody to come together on a common agenda and a common ground. The differences, there were two major there was a public difference. The public difference, of course, which has been written about, was that Now Congressman John Lewis, who was then the young chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, he had written a rather fiery speech, the text of which was objected to by some members of the coalition, principally by Archbishop O'Boyle, who represented the Catholic Church and the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C., and it was very important to us to maintain that coalition and to have the Archbishop's participation and the Catholic Church participation in Washington, D.C., and he objected to some of the language. And so we had to negotiate with John Lewis for him to remove and to revise some of the language so that it would not offend the Archbishop and we could keep his participation. Now that was what was publicly known. What was not so publicly known is there was in the organization, during the period as the March date became closer, the question of who was going to be the last speaker. That is, how much time was going to be allotted to each speaker, and then the sequence of each speaker. And there was some feeling that Dr. King should have no more time than any other participant on the program. And then there was a great deal of initial pressure that he not be the last speaker. I simply asked the question, do any of you really want to follow Martin Luther King Jr.? Have you heard him speak? Do you really want to follow him? Because I suggested that if he spoke earlier, is that you ran the risk that a large number of people would get up and leave the march, because it was our opinion that the overwhelming majority of the people who were coming to Washington that day, they were coming to participate in this great assembly, of human rights assembly, but they also were coming to hear, as A. Philip Randolph introduced Martin King to the crowd, as the greatest moral leader of our nation. And so I felt that he should be the last speaker, and he should have the larger amount of time. And eventually that view prevailed.
Now, you talk about egos. What about Martin Luther King's own ego? Was he an egotistical man? Did he want to be the centre and the focus of the March on Washington?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Your question implies, yes, like all human beings, like all persons, he had an ego, and he had a sense of self-confidence. But he didn't have an ego, and I think in the common parlance, that his ego was going to cloud his judgment or make him insist on wanting to have things or be in a privileged position that he otherwise would not be entitled to. Yes, in fact, personally, he felt that he should be the last speaker, and I felt, and Stanley Levison wasn't there, but other people who were associated with me, like Baird Rustin, we felt that it would not be appropriate for Martin Luther King Jr. to insist or to speak on his behalf, and so that's what he had me for. I mean, I was his lawyer, so I wanted to represent him and to say to the other people in the March organization what he could not comfortably say. Mm. The fact that he could not comfortably say it did not. I'm not suggesting that he had an ego. He had an ego, but not in the sense that it was oversized.
Let's talk about your recollections of the day of the march. Security in Washington was very tight that day, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. We did not know it at the time. We knew about some of the things at the time. For example, we knew that all leaves for the members of the Washington, D.C. police force had been canceled, so that the force was on standby 24 hours. We did not know that a special military unit, the 82nd Airborne, or either the 101st Airborne Paratrooper Division, had been put on standby and was at a nearby military base. We also didn't know that that some 15,000 regular military troops had been put on standby alert. So security was tight. There was concern principally by the government and the Justice Department that there might be violence, and one could not obviously say that there would not be violence, but we felt that the likelihood of violence was relatively small. Not that you could guarantee that there would be no violence, but we felt we knew the nature of the people who were assembling. Those people who were assembling were committed to nonviolent civil disobedience in protest to injustice.
Let's, while you're talking about nonviolence, hear another clip from the speech, and here Martin Luther King Jr. emphasizes the importance of nonviolence to the movement.
We've come to see the power of nonviolence. We've come to see that this method is not a weak method, for it's the strong man who can stand up amid opposition, who can stand up amid violence being inflicted upon him and not retaliate with violence.
Now, in relation to the speech itself, who had input into the speech that Martin Luther King actually brought with him to the podium?
Well, there were several persons that had input, say during the 30 days or the previous 3 weeks, the 3 weeks previous to the march. There was, of course, Bayard Rustin, Andrew Young.
He was the coordinator of the march.
He was the, well, A. Philip Randolph was the chairman, but Bayard Rustin was sort of like the chief of staff, so to speak, the coordinator. And I was privileged to be what was sometimes called the kitchen cabinet or research committee of close advisors to Martin King. So immediately preceding the march, that is, the 3 weeks preceding, he had gotten advice from several people. The week preceding, the days preceding, that was narrowed to a number of people who were at the march and whom he just wanted to have a last-minute check with. And of course, it was my task at one point during the night preceding the march to try to take notes and to summarize the various suggestions that people had made in the lobby, in the corner of the lobby of the Willard Hotel, and to put in a suggested textual form some language that he might consider using.
So he brings a speech, a written speech, to the podium, and he does refer to that speech. He does read from that speech. You mentioned in the book that you were delighted to hear some of the words that you yourself had written or were responsible for coming out in the early part of the speech. But the whole I Have a Dream section, which was the really electrifying part of the speech, that wasn't in the original text.
In the original text, there was no mention of I Have a Dream whatsoever. And when he got somewhere about the 8th or 9th paragraph, reading from written material, his favorite gospel singer, Mahalia Jackson, who was on the podium with him, turned to him and shouted to him, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." And I watched him move to the side the written text and grab a hold of the podium, look out at this vast crowd of people. And I said to the person standing next to me, because I could read his body language, I said, "These people don't know it, but they're about ready to go to church." Now, I've tried to think as to why Mahalia Jackson did that, why she interrupted him. And I think, this is just my opinion how many years later now, as I reflect on it, is that I think while she admired, as we all did, what he was saying, I think she was in effect using a code word like, "I want to hear you preach, Martin. Tell him about the dream." Now, he had used those phrases, "I have a dream," in a speech in June in Detroit in Cobalt Hall in a venue where he was speaking to a large number of people in June of 1963. But the use of those words at that time had not anywhere near the effect it had. It was like a transcendental experience. It was like watching him was seeing lightning captured in a bottle. Mahalia's plea to him, Mahalia's interruption, triggered something in him that literally transformed him immediately into this extraordinary orator, even greater than he normally was. He seemed to just develop a unique, extraordinary life of his own, almost breaking beyond the bounds of that human being. It's like there was two Martin Kings. There was something so unique and special coming out of this human body that you had never seen before or heard before.
Did you know that you were at a very, very special occasion and you were listening to one of the great speeches?
I knew as I listened that Martin Luther King Jr. was speaking in a way and with a configuration of language and images that I had never heard him use before. I also knew that the setting, speaking before some 250,000 plus people, the magnificent late afternoon sun, the Lincoln Memorial, all of those things seemed to come together. And so I knew that I was experiencing and witnessing something that I had never, ever seen or heard before.
Now, you took the step of copywriting the speech. Why did you do that?
I did that because I wanted to prevent it from being used and exploited by any number of people who would want to use what he said or what he did or photographs with him for their own personal profit. And I had no idea that this speech per se as a speech was going to be of such importance and consequence that it should be copyrighted. It was really a defensive measure on my part. It was like, I'm just going to be sure that this time, what he says cannot be used and exploited, not thinking at all that this speech was in any way going to be something special.
And who has benefited from that copyright?
Well, the King estate. It's part of their part of the intellectual properties that comprises the King estate, and I'm happy that they have some benefit. You know, America has such an extraordinary debt to Martin Luther King Jr. You can't even quantify in dollars what could be paid to his family or to the King estate for the extraordinary legacy and contribution of this man. So I don't know what amount of money that speech, turns out or on an annual basis, but whatever it is, it's not enough in comparison to his contribution.
Naturally enough, towards the end of the book, you get on to Barack Obama. And do you see the influence of Martin Luther King on Barack Obama specifically, or is it just a black preaching influence in general?
Oh, no. I see an influence on Barack Obama specifically. If any of your listeners can remember Obama's speech in 2000 and whenever it was, 2007 maybe, when he announced his candidacy that he was going to run for the presidency of the United States on the steps of the State House in Springfield, Illinois. In the opening paragraphs and sentences of his speech announcing his candidacy, he said, "I am running for the fierce urgency of now." And the fierce urgency of now is a direct quote from the 7th paragraph of the I Have a Dream speech.
Why did it take you so long to write, let's call it the book of the movie?
I love that. There's been books written about the March on Washington. There have even been books written about the speech. But no one has written or could write a narrative inside account of what went on. And I had read a lot of different books, a lot of different articles, and I've listened to a lot of different people speak about it. And none of them have it exactly accurate. They're off the bullseye. And I felt, as I say in the book, as the horizon gets closer in my own life, that if I don't make a record and set the record straight, there's going to be an enormous blank space in history of that period.
Well, it's a great read, and it's been a pleasure and indeed a privilege to talk to you, Clarence. Behind the Dream by Clarence B. Jones and Stuart Connolly is published by Palgrave Macmillan. Thank you very much indeed for talking to us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I will go out with you and transform dark yesterdays into bright tomorrows. With this faith, we will be able to achieve this new day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing with the Negroes in the spiritual of all, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty.
Absolutely inspiring speech by Dr. Martin Luther King. Makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, Margaret, even now, doesn't it?
It's. I just feel so emotional every time I listen to that. So inspiring.
If you haven't seen it, go and have a look at it on YouTube. It is absolutely amazing. Now, you were born a few weeks after Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Did you, in New York, I mean, we don't associate New York with any of this, with any kind of discrimination, but did you witness, obviously you wouldn't have experienced it yourself directly, but did you witness much discrimination there when you were growing up?
Yes, I did. And it's amazing, how you think about, well, what's normal? What's normal to you, you don't question, really, until you go along. And I guess when I was small, I was just surrounded by all white people, and I didn't question it that much. I grew up in kind of a wealthy Irish and Italian-American town in Long Island, and we rarely saw black people and African-American people or any person of color. And if we did, they were cleaners or they were gardeners or they, were collecting rubbish bins. And I guess I didn't question that, but I didn't know a lot of people of color, but I thought that was normal. And it wasn't until I got older and I went to secondary school that I realized that there were only 2 girls in my secondary school class. It was an all-girls school who were black, and only one child in my primary school had been black. And one day, it was 1985, and this girl in my law club was driving me home. She had a car, and she was African-American. She's probably one of the brightest people I'd ever met. Extremely well-spoken, opinionated, and worked really hard. And there were 4 of us in the car, and we drove over the border from Hempstead, which was a black town, into Garden City, which was a white town. I mean, hence segregation existed even in 1985 and still does today. And the minute that we crossed the border, we were pulled over by the police. Now, it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We were all in our school uniforms, and the police officer came over and really started giving this girl a very hard time, looking at her, saying, "What are you doing? Where are you going? What's your name? Who do you think you are?" And this really bright, opinionated girl just looked down, said nothing, didn't look him in the eye. I couldn't believe it, Myles. I just thought, what is going on here?
Was she used to this kind of thing?
Well, until that moment, I hadn't realized it. But yes, she was. Obviously, she was used to this, and this is the way she had been conditioned, don't give lip to the white police officer. So this went on, and eventually I said to the police officer, because my friend was mute, I said, "Can I ask why we're being pulled over? Do we have a broken taillight? Were we speeding?" And he kind of ignored me and continued to harangue this poor girl, and I asked him again, and he said, who are you, and where do you live? And once I gave him my address in Garden City, he said, "Oh, right, sorry, off you go."
And that hasn't really changed much, or has it?
No, it hasn't. And this is kind of the untold story in the United States, I think, where so many people say, oh, it's the land of the free and the home of the brave. Well, it's not the land of opportunity for people of color that it still is for white people. So we have a lot of segregation, and a lot of it is based on income levels. So white people who have more opportunity live in wealthier places, and their public school systems are better because of the tax base, the property taxes that go into the public school system. But in a place like Hempstead is still overwhelmingly black and poor.
And the prison population of the United States is
overwhelmingly African American.
And that's not going to change anytime soon either, is it?
No. So, I mean, we can look at, the beauty and the eloquence of the I Have a Dream speech and know that we've come a distance, but we haven't come far enough.
3 years ago, obviously, we witnessed the inauguration of the first black president of the United States, Barack Obama. It was a highly emotional moment for the African American population of the USA. Significant?
Absolutely significant. Yeah, this puts a marker down. Think of all the young African American boys and girls and people of colour in the United States who now look at the highest office in the land and say, I can be president. And they can believe that now, whereas before it was always a white man.
Jesse Jackson was at President Obama's acceptance speech. He witnessed that in Grant Park in Chicago. This is how he remembers that day.
We were in that same park 40 years earlier, fighting against the war, and we were being tear gas in that same Grant Park 40 years earlier. But as he was coming out, it was the joy of the moment and the journey. The joy of the moment he had won, but I looked around, the people who laid the groundwork for his winning were not there. He ran the great last lap, as great fast runners do, of a 60-year campaign. But the people who had made that night possible for the most part could not be there. And this was their night.
Now, it was a very emotional day, Margaret, for Jesse Jackson. It was a very emotional day for African Americans, a very emotional day for all of us, let's face it. And it was an historical election. And as you were saying before we heard Jesse Jackson, it means that every black kid can say, I can be president of the USA. But does it really change much? Has it really changed much? Will it really change much for African Americans, do you think?
Well, it's just like Ireland, Myles. You know, change is incremental. And we just have to keep going. We just have to know the change comes dripping slow.
Okay, thank you very, very much indeed for that look back at the civil rights movement and even further back into the 18th and 19th centuries at slavery. Margaret E. Ward, thank you very much. That's all we have time for this week. Before I go, a quick note about our March book club choice, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, An Indian History of the American West by D. Brown, published by Holt. We're going to be discussing that on next week's programme. A podcast of this programme and the full public interview with Jesse Jackson is available through the RTE website. And many thanks once again for joining me to Margaret Ward, and thanks too to Hope Brown, the actor who gave voice to the slaves' experiences heard earlier in the programme. Until the same time next week, from me, Myles Dungan, and producer Yeti Redmond, goodbye.